Okay, so I'm back. And in the last video, we saw how to use Maya lights, and we saw that they can render out with Mental Ray, not just with the Maya software renderer. In this video, we're going to have a look at something called a Mental Ray area light. So what's a Mental Ray area light? Well, let me go ahead and show you. Let's go to the Create menu, let's go to Lights, and we'll go to Area Light. Once we do that, we'll just move the area light up like this. And if you notice, it's the same area light that we worked with in the previous video. If I do a render, and actually let me do an IPR instead so we can interactively see this this render. Let's hit Control A to open up the attribute editor here, and let's increase the intensity of this light. Okay, let's also add shadows to this, and we'll add ray trace shadows, not depth map shadows. Okay, let's increase that intensity a little bit more, just so it's really visible. I'll increase the intensity to about 20. And there's our area light. Now that is a Maya software area light. Okay, that's the one that we saw in the previous video before this one. Now what we're going to do is we're going to see a Mental Ray area light. So if we go down here to the Mental Ray section here, and you'll notice that we have this area light section of parameters and settings. What we want to do is turn on Use Light Shape, and that basically turns on the Mental Ray area light. Now you notice that right now it's blown out. The Mental area light works with light intensities a little bit different than the Maya area light. Okay, so this intensity is too bright, so let's go ahead and reduce that by a good amount. And what we'll do is we'll add some light decay to this to make it look more realistic. So I'll add some quadratic light decay, and that'll force us to have to use a higher intensity number. So let's go with something like 100. That's too low, so let's go with 500. That's a little bit better. Let's try 600 here, just to see how that looks. Okay, a little bit better. And I'm going to zoom out of my camera there a little bit. Okay, so there's the area light. The area light shadows are very realistic. That's because they're very sharp when the shadows are cast close to an object. And as the shadow gets farther away from an object, the shadows will actually soften up. This is the way that shadows work in the real world. And you can try it yourself. Just go outside on a sunny day and take an object. It can be any object, say a can, a soda can or anything like that, and place it on your front lawn, or better yet on a sidewalk or something like that, and just look at the shadows. And you notice that the shadows that are close to the can are going to be sharp right on the sidewalk right after they pass the can. As the shadows go farther and farther away from the can on the sidewalk, you notice that the shadows actually become softer and softer. This is the way that lights work in the real world. So let me do something here. I'm going to go ahead and try to zoom in here on this shadow. Okay, if I zoom in pretty close, and I'm going to increase the light intensity here to about 1000, just so we can see the shadow better. You notice that the shadow has this graininess to it, which doesn't look too good. Okay, to get rid of some of that graininess, we could turn up the anti-aliasing in the render settings, but we don't want to exactly do that. That's what we have this high samples parameter for here in the area light. Right now by default, this parameter is set to a value of 8. Okay, but that's much too low. And if I lower that to say 2, it gets very nasty. You can see it gets very grainy and disgusting and is not suitable for production render. But if I go back to 8, it looks better. If I go to 16, it looks even better. And if I jump up to 32, it looks even better. Now, the higher the amount of samples you use, the longer your render is going to take. So you're going to slow down your overall rendering time if you increase the high samples too much. My recommendation is to use between 32 and 64 for a final render. Though 32 for most intents and purposes actually looks good enough, especially after you've applied anti-aliasing to your entire render for a production. Okay, so let me actually zoom out here. I'm going to go up a little bit so I can see the light. It's a little bit hard to see, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the IPR button, and I'm going to maybe zoom in here a little bit. I'm going to do right there an IPR of that area. I want to do an IPR that catches the light up there because I want to show you something. Right here under the type, we can change the shape of the light. Okay, now changing the shape of the light will actually change the way that the light casts shadows into your scene and the way that the light actually has casts its intensity into the scene. So the shape actually makes a huge difference. Okay, so what we can actually do is we can turn on this visibility flag here, and by doing that it makes the light visible. And I'll show you that. Let me close that. Let me kind of come in here like this so I can see the actual light back there. Something like this will work out pretty good. Okay, let me do an IPR of this. I'll just render out the entire section here. And you can see there's the area light. If I turn it back off, turn the visibility off, the area light is no longer visible. And when I turn it back on, now the area light is visible. This is useful for if you want to make your area light visible in your render, almost like if it was a, say, a square rectangular light pane on the ceiling of an interior room, which can be seen in a lot of office buildings and things like that. And we have these different shapes. We can switch from rectangle to a disc. It's just going to create a disc-like shape right there. We can also switch to a sphere, which creates an actual sphere for the light. And then there's cylinder, which creates an actual cylinder, and you can use that. That's great for creating, say, a fluorescent light tube or something like that for an interior scene. And then we have this user option here, which isn't going to give us a shape. That's for if you're creating a custom shader. You can actually create a custom mental ray shader that can give this object a custom shape. But we're not going to go over that in this tutorial. Okay, so let's go to, say, sphere, for example, and there's our sphere. Now, controlling the intensity here will control how bright that sphere looks. So as I drop the intensity, the sphere becomes dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. Let me go back to an intensity of 1000. At an intensity of 1000, our scene here is pretty brightly lit. In fact, it has too much light. So let me go ahead and lower that to about 500. And that looks much better. As you can see, now everything is not blown out, and there aren't these burning highlights in our scene. And there's our sphere. It's too dark. Well, let's say I want to keep this lighting and I want this sphere to become brighter looking without making this lighting too bright. How could I do that? Well, that's where the shape intensity parameter down here comes into play. With the shape intensity, we can actually increase the intensity of the actual area light shape without affecting the brightness and intensity of the light itself. So the intensity stays intact, but the brightness of the actual sphere increases. So the sphere looks like it's brighter, even though the light in the scene is staying exactly the same and doesn't change at all. This is extremely useful if you're looking to make this area light appear to be brighter, or at least the source of the area light appear to be brighter. So it's a pretty useful parameter to use right there. Okay? So that's pretty much the mental ray area light. Pretty simple to use, pretty straightforward. Has some optimization features here. And it's very realistic and great for doing interior scenes. And for doing very realistic, photorealistic scenes, you always want to use area lights, as they're the best to use in those kinds of situations. Okay? And then down here we have some more mental ray parameters, like the global illumination parameters. But we'll go over that once we get to the chapter in this tutorial regarding global illumination and caustics. Okay? So that's going to do it for the mental ray area light. I'm going to end this video here. And in the next video, we're going to go ahead and get started on global illumination with mental ray. And that one's going to be a lot more funner than this one.